Hello, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Lizzi Kehoe, and today I'm going to walk you through my senior honors thesis virtually. It's titled Help the Helpers Exploring Secondary Trauma Among First Responders at Washington University in St. Louis. I did my best to consolidate 101 pages, including my bibliography, into about 20 slides, but obviously I wasn't able to spend the time that I want to on everything that I did in the document. But hopefully it's enough to convince you or to at least hold your interest for a bit. Anyway, I hope you enjoy, and just a heads up, some slides are a little denser than the others, so feel free to pause the video when necessary. So, just last order of business before we get into the good stuff, I just want to thank my thesis advisor, Jamie Ake, and my two readers, Barbara Baumgartner and Marianne Zubak. You all are the best. My presentation is divided into 4 sections, and here is a presentation overview. Let's dive into section 1. By engaging with the topic of secondary or vicarious trauma, I hope to produce feminist qualitative research, which I'll explain the importance of in the second portion of this presentation. I also hoped that through my research, I could give something tangible back to the community of first responders and to the participants in this study. Based on my findings, this looked like policy and training recommendations, and hopefully some virtual or in real life conversations in the future. From the literature review, I gleaned insight on widely cited risk and protective factors, but struggled to find comprehensive studies, ones that address the many facets of ST/VT, and I could hardly find any studies on the paraprofessional population. I used qualitative research methods for a variety of reasons, but the main reason I think is best exemplified by this quote from Ann Opie. Opie states, qualitative research can importantly assist in political empowerment through the incorporation in published research of participants' multiple and very different voices, so that the way ideology can smooth over differences is disrupted and questioned, and through the encouragement as a result of participation in the research of individual and collective challenging of the system. While I originally sought to establish the presence of secondary or vicarious trauma among the first responder population on WashU's campus, as my research questions evolved, I soon realized how this study could be an educational process for both me as the researcher and the participants in this study, with a more exploratory ethnographic approach, framed by these 4 tenets, more or less, of my methodologies. This slide, I decided to display a chart that provides just a very basic overview of who my participants were and thus where my data comes from. To protect confidentiality, all my participants chose a pseudonym or had one chosen for them. To reiterate what I mentioned in the beginning, the weight of my thesis really relies on the quotes that I pulled from these interviews. While I wrote this thesis, my participants really gave me the data, though most of the quotes and textual evidence are not in this presentation. Again, the purpose of this study was not to necessarily determine the presence of ST/VT among my participants. Rather, I sought to understand on a broader level how first responders navigate their roles of ST/VT. Given that past research did not fully address the varying levels of experiences of ST/VT, I approached my analysis mindful of the socio-ecological model, a framework often used in public health and violence prevention settings, which nests the individual within the interpersonal, organizational, and the community. This framework emphasizes multiple levels of influence and asserts the idea that behaviors shape and are shaped by the social environment, a connection I sought to demonstrate in this study. In my research, I identify and analyze the factors and variables that help or hinder first responders' ability to cope with their role, and furthermore, investigate how the effects reverberate on the interpersonal and organizational levels. In my thesis, after providing an overview of the 3 organizations of Sarah, EST, and Uncle Joe's, which I won't do right now because of time, I then ground my discussion in first my participants' understanding of ST/VT, some of which is supported by the literature. I then move into community context, so the big ring around the model from the last slide. Then the exacerbating factors of ST/VT related to gender and race. I conclude with the section on naming and my recommendations. Now this is quite a busy slide, so feel free to take a moment to pause. But the main gist is that I first discuss the factors and variables that were explicitly identified by my participants that were also largely supported by the research. On this slide, I also mentioned community context, which followed the discussion of individual factors and variables, as I believe the context of WashU determines the influence of some of these variables. Another professional, with the pseudonym Stephanie, described WashU as having a lot more perfectionism, self hate, and the inability to take care of oneself compared to her previous employment at SLU. So, another busy slide. I apologize, but for this one, I really suggest taking a pause to read the quotes I did choose to pull from participants. My next set of findings bridge the varying levels of influence on the socio-ecological model and present concerning implications. Though these implications extend to the field in general, I sought to offer a more nuanced dialogue about ST/VT by recognizing specific factors, be they individual, community, or policy level, that impact certain first responders more than others. Past studies often analyze the impact of the content of the first responder role on the individual. Past studies, however, did not fully address the way in which other factors, such as identity or organizational context, shape the impact of this content and can therefore influence the entire trajectory of a first responder. For example, the paraprofessionals working on this very campus who may become professionals or not as a result of their experience. By examining such factors, specifically gender and race, I demonstrate how identity influences one's motivation or ability to apply, as well as their experience and involvement within the organization. In the groups that provide emotional support, so Uncle Joe's and Sarah, there exists a pervasive stereotype of the quote unquote soft spoken white woman as the ideal provider, as Shay, one of my participants, described. In EST, though there are gendered assumptions and underlying attitudes, a rigid identity of who is in EST or what an EST member looks like does not exist. Furthermore, the majority of the participants in this study are students at WashU, an institution with a long history of providing inadequate resources for students with marginalized identities, particularly as it pertains to mental health. In this slide, I posed the questions that came up in this section of my research, and ones that I tried to answer, but ones that I'm nonetheless still left pondering. On this slide, I explain the portion of my research related to naming, which asserts the power of naming itself and also maintains the nuances of meanings based on experiences. While participants may have had disparate understandings and usages of debriefing, for example, Lila, a participant in Sarah, finds debriefing useful and a way to alleviate some of her insecurities as a peer counselor by allowing her to confirm with a peer that they would have handled the situation in a similar fashion, etc. This section, though, builds on the previous section by acknowledging and demonstrating how race and gender can then pose barriers for debriefing, because those factors also influence a first responder's capacity to establish safety, comfort, and support within the group, which are all absolutely necessary for a successful debriefing. I present similar findings regarding self care. As one participant noted, love the term self care because it's super important and people at WashU don't do it enough. Honestly, people in Sarah don't do it enough. I think some of the worst people with self care are in Sarah. Again, there is a similar pattern with vicarious trauma, but I'm highlighting this quote from Betsy because her interview really showcased how important it was for her to have the tools to name her experience with ST/VT. Participants from the group Sarah were among the only participants, aside from the professionals, who knew about the concept before this interview because of a presentation and exercise the group had done the previous year. This activity enabled Betsy to name her experience and find empowerment by admitting and accepting that she did all she could in the moment in her role as a first responder to a student in crisis, and that was enough. With this theme, I try to emphasize how the process of naming ST/VT has a domino effect. Not only can it empower an individual, like Betsy, but by inviting more vulnerable and honest conversations about the impacts of the first responder role, naming ST/VT can interrupt the WashU culture of perfectionism. Furthermore, the naming process can positively impact the group and group dynamics by facilitating the development of supportive and knowledgeable networks that then become part of the norm and group structure. This is to say that although the perfectionist culture may still persist, naming ST/VT can actually enable first responders to offer a counter narrative, one of vulnerability, of honesty, of shamelessly finding interactions difficult, because they usually are. My study acknowledges and demonstrates the importance of addressing ST/VT at varying levels, particularly among the paraprofessional population. Paraprofessional first responder groups on college campuses are becoming more common. Moving forward, research needs to take up how specific contexts and their exacerbating factors affect wider populations of paraprofessionals. For groups already in place, such as those on WashU's campus, I provide the following recommendations based on the findings of my research. I hope these recommendations can inspire and incite change at varying levels, as this study demonstrates the importance of. I first recommend naming an education about ST/VT, for reasons I previously discussed. I see this as an opportunity for groups to then collaborate and share knowledge production processes. In my third recommendation, I discuss the implications of my findings relative to race and gender, and propose strategies to address these findings. My last recommendation relies on that of a participant, actually, one of the professionals who noted that the professionals in this field have to make sure they're checking in on and training and supporting the students who are also doing this work in this field.